Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. We are going to go over the questions from chapter 5. We just finished that chapter, so that would have been part B, but some of these questions were a little different than what we're used to. So let's look at that first one. It says, what characteristics do you look for in a friend? Are some characteristics a deal breaker and mean that you cannot be friends? So this question is related to our story because Serafina is kind of going through this awkward time with Braden where she doesn't know, she kind of blew their friendship up, where she kind of might have not been the most sincere. Like she said, she almost hissed at him and things, so she doesn't know if they're friends or if they're not friends. And so some characteristics that, and this question is more based on your opinion. We can't find this question in our book, so we just have to think about it for ourselves. Like, what do I think is good to have in a friend? And when I think about my friends, I think me and my friends were honest to each other, so that's a good characteristic to have, so you have some trust in there. I think another good characteristic is to be a good listener, because if you want to tell them something, you want them to listen to you so that they can reply back and maybe help you with something or things like that. And you also have to be a good listener too to be a good friend. And then another good characteristic is being dependable. So if you need something from someone, you can depend on that person and they can help you with something. And then the opposite of that, what are characteristics that won't be good for a friend? Well, I would think more the opposite. So if you're always honest, then a good characteristic is not to be a liar, right? You don't want that. Someone who always is just telling about themselves, you might want to say, hey, well, I have some concerns too. And if someone is never dependable, then that might not be a good characteristic as well. So that's obviously an opinion. So you might have something of your own. You can talk about that to your family or to a friend or anything else that you think is a good characteristic and bad characteristics of friends. Second question is, do you agree with Paul that there are differences between people and you should stay away? I think it depends on what differences there are. If we're talking about like physical or differences, like the way someone looks, like, oh, that person has blonde hair and I don't want to be their friend, I don't think that's a good way to stay away from people. If you get along with people, then you should definitely be friends with them. And that's my opinion. This is another opinion-based question. So physical features don't really bother. I don't think that those should matter in friendship. But if you're like personality-wise completely different than someone, then I don't think you should stay away. I think you should get to try to learn about that person and then see if you all could be friends. So that's the way I feel about that. And number 3, what did we learn from Mr. Pratt and Miss Whitney? Well, there are 2 things that we learned from Mr. Pratt and Miss Whitney in chapter 5. If you are in your book and the first thing that we learned is on page 69. And we learned this right here. It says, the girl talking about Claire Bram, she is a pianist. So she plays piano all around the world, which is super cool. And the second thing that we learned is just on the next page, and it is on page 70. And we learned that there is a secret door in the billiard room. And it says, Mr. Pratt pushed the oak panel wall just to the right of the fireplace. Oh my, Miss Whitney said in surprise, laughing nervously as the concealed door opened. I cleaned this room countless times and I never knew that was there. You're so clever, Mr. Pratt. So that's super exciting. So we're going to continue on reading on chapter 6 to see what happens. All right, so hello. If you remember, we had just went over those questions, so we are going to back up just a little bit and just figure out where we are with our story. So the last thing we read in chapter 5 was, Mr. Crankshould, a firm, authoritative voice said from behind her. It wasn't just a name, it was a command. Startled, the ugly man stopped, shaking her. He set her on her feet and began to smooth her hair, pretending that he had actually been taking care of her all along. Gasping for breath, she turned to look at who had spoken. There stood Braden Vanderbilt at the top of the steps. All right, chapter 6, if you're following along, we are on page 78. Serafina's heart sprang. Despite the terrible situation he had caught her in and the angry expression on his face, she was glad to see Braden. The crab-cranky Mr. Crenshaw, however, was far less pleased. "Young Master Vanderbilt," he grumbled in surprise as he bowed, wiping the tobacco spittle from his lips and stood at the attention. "I beg your pardon, sir. I didn't see you there. Your coach is ready, sir." Braden looked at both of them without speaking. Clearly, he wasn't pleased by what he had just seen. The boy's Doberman appeared to be ready to attack whichever of them his master told him to. And Serafina hoped that it was going to be the Sputnam-faced Mr. Crenshaw, rather than her. Braden stared at Mr. Crenshaw, then slowly moved his eyes to her. Her mind whirled with potential cover stories. He had stopped the mountainous brute from shaking the living daylights out of her, but what could she say to explain her presence here? "I'm the new shoe-shine girl," she said, stepping forward. "Your aunt asked me to make sure your boots were well shined for your trip, sir. Spit and polish good, sir." That's what she said, all right. Spit and polish good. "No, no, no," Mr. Crenshaw shouted, knowing it was a ruse. "What's this now, you little beggar? You ain't no shoe-shining girl. Who is ya, and where'd you come from?" But a smile of delicious conspiracy formed at the corner of Braden's mouth. "Ah, yes. Aunt Edith did mention something about getting my boots shined. I had quite forgotten," he said, exaggerating the aristocrat air in his voice. Then he looked at her sharply, and his eyes furrowed into a frown. "I'm on my way to the Vances, and I'm running late. I don't have time to wait on you, so you'll have to come with me and do it in the carriage on the way." Serafina felt the blood rush to her face. Was he serious? She couldn't go in a carriage with him. Her pa would kill her. And what's she going to do all cooped up in there anyway, getting dragged around in a box with a bunch of four-legged black hoof stompers? "Well, come along. Let's be quick about it," Braden said, his voice filled with the impatience of a lordly gentleman as he gestured towards the carriage door. She had never been in a carriage in her life. She didn't even know how to get in one or what to do once she did. The ill-tempered, rat-faced Mr. Crenshaw had no choice but to obey young master's commands. He shoved Serafina towards the door and suddenly found herself in the dimly lit interior of the Vanderbilt carriage. As she crouched uncertainly on the floor, she could not help but marvel at the carriage's luxurious, appointed finery, with its hand-carved woodwork, brass fixtures, beveled glass windows, and plush paisley tufted seats. Braden followed her in with the grace of familiarity and took a seat. Gideon sat on the floor, eyeing her with his vague intent. "Mind your own business, dog," she thought as she stared back at him. Mr. Crenshaw shut the carriage door and climbed up onto the driver's bench with the other coachman. "Great. Ratface is driving us," Serafina thought. She had no idea how long this trip would be or how she could send word back to her pa. He had ordered her to hide in the basement, not get kidnapped by the young master and his stink-breath henchmen. But at least she'd finally be able to talk to Braden alone about what she saw the night before. The carriage seat looked too clean for her to sit on with her basement clothing, and she was supposed to be cleaning the young master's boots. So she knelt on the floor of the carriage and wondered how she was going to pretend to clean his boots when she didn't have any brushes or polish. Spit and polish was one thing, but just spit was another. "You don't really have to clean my boots," Braden said softly. "I was just going along with your story." Just as Serafina looked up at him and their eyes were about to meet, the horses pulled the carriage and jounced forward. In a moment as unusual as it was mortifying, she actually lost her balance. I'm sorry," she mumbled, as she fell against Braden's legs and then quickly straightened herself up. She glanced at the seat that she suspected she was supposed to be sitting on, but the dog stared at her with his steely eyes. When she moved towards the seat, the dog growled, low and menacing, baring his teeth to say, "If you can't sit on that seat, then neither will you." "No, Gideon," Braden chastised him. She couldn't decide if the young master had spoken the command because he wanted to protect her or if he just didn't want to get the inside of his carriage bloody. In any case, Gideon's ears crumbled and his head lowered underneath the force of his master's reprimand. Seeing her chance, she slipped into the seat opposite Braden and as far away from the dog as possible. As Gideon continued staring at her, she felt an overwhelming desire to hiss at him and make him back off, but she didn't think that would go over too well with the young master, so she held back the urge. She had never liked dogs, and dogs had never liked her. Whenever they saw her, they barked. One time, she had to scurry up a tree to get away from a Corray's foxhound, and her paw had to use a ladder to retrieve her. When the carriage rumbled to a turn, Serafina looked out the window and saw the grand facade of the house. Biltmore Estate rose 4 stories high with its ornately carved gray stone walls. Gargoyles and ancient warriors adorned the dark copper edges. Chimneys, turrets, and towers formed the spires of its almost Gothic presence. 2 giant statues of lions guarded the massive oak doors at the entrance as if warding off evil spirits. She had marveled at the house's statues many times on her midnight prowls. She had always loved them. She imagined that those great cats were Biltmore's protectors, its guardians, and she couldn't think of no more important job. In the golden light of the setting sun, the mansion really could be quite startlingly lovely. But as the sun withdrew its brightness behind the surrounding mountains, it cast an ominous shadows across the estate, which reminded her of griffins, chimeras, and other twisted creatures of the night that were half one thing and half another. The thought of it gave her a shudder. In one moment, the estate was the most beautiful home you had ever seen, but in the next, it was dark and foreboding, haunted castle. "Lie down and be good," Braden said. She looked at him in surprise and then realized that he was talking to the dog and not her. Gideon complied with his master's request and laid down at his feet. The dog seemed to be a little more relaxed now, but when he looked at Serafina, his expression seemed to say, "Just because I'm lying down, don't think for a second that if you do something to my master, I still can't kill you." She smiled to herself. She couldn't help it. She was beginning to like this dog. She could understand him, his fierceness and loyalty. She admired that. As she tried to get used to the rumbling motion of the moving carriage, she noticed that Braden was studying her. "I've been looking for you," he said. She stole a quick glance at him, then looked away. When she looked into his eyes, it felt like he could tell her what she was thinking, and it was unnerving. She tried to say something, but when she opened her mouth, she could barely breathe. Of course, she snuck around enough over the years to overhear people of all walks of life speaking to one another, so theoretically, she knew how it was done. So many guests and servants has passed through Biltmore over the years that she could take on a rich lady's air or a mountain woman's twang or even a New York accent. But for some reason, she struggled mightily to find the right words, any words, to say to the young master. I'm sorry about all of this," she said finally. The annoying constriction in her chest seemed to be strangling her words as she spoke them. She wasn't sure if she sounded like anything like a halfway normal person or not. "I mean, I'm sorry about being dumped into your carriage like luggage that wouldn't fit on the roof, and I don't know why your dog doesn't like me." Braden looked at Gideon and then back at her. He normally likes people, especially girls. It's strange. "There are plenty of strange things happening today," she said, her chest loosening up a bit as she began to realize Braden was actually going to talk to her. "You think so, too?" he said, leaning towards her. He wasn't anything like she had imagined the young master of Vanderbilt Mansion would be, especially as good-looking and well-educated as he was. She had expected him to be snobbish, bossy, aloof, and he was none of these things. "I don't think Claire Brams is hiding," he said in a conspiratorial tone. "Do you?" "No," she said, raising her eyes at him. "I definitely don't." She wanted to pour it all out and tell him everything she knew that had been her plan all along, but her paused words kept going through her mind. "They ain't our kind of folks, Sarah." Whatever he was, Braden seemed to be a good person. As he was talking to her, he didn't judge her or discount her. If anything, he actually seemed to like her, or maybe he was just fascinated by her in some way that he would be by a weird species of insect that he had never seen before. But either way, he kept talking. "She's not the first one, you know," he whispered. "What do you mean?" she said, drawing closer to him. 2 weeks ago, a 15-year-old girl named Anastasia Rostinova went out for a walk in the evening in the Rambles, and she didn't come back. "Really?" she asked, hanging on every word. She had thought she had something to tell him, but it turned out that he had just as much to tell her. A boy who whispered about kidnapping and skullduggery was the kind of boy she could learn to like. She knew the Rambles well, but she also knew that the shrubbery maze of crisscrossing paths caused many people great confusion. Everyone said Anastasia must have wandered into the forest and gotten lost, he continued, or that she ran away from home. "But I know they're wrong." "How do you know?" she asked, keen to hear the details. "The next morning I found her little white dog wandering around the paths of the Rambles. The poor dog was frantic, desperately searching for her." Braden looked at Gideon. "I didn't know Anastasia well. She'd only been visiting with her father for a couple of days when she disappeared. But I don't think she would have ran away and left her dog behind." Serafina thought that sounded right. Braden seemed as loyal to Gideon as Gideon was to him. They were friends, and she liked that. And she thought about that poor girl and what might have happened to her. And that is where we're going to stop today. Thank you for listening.